Welcome back to Crime Time, Inc. Today, we're going into the world of government secrets and mind control experiments and a suspicious death, the MKUltra program.
Yeah, it's a very controversial part of history. MKUltra was a top-secret CIA project. It ran from the 1950s to the early 1970s, and it was really all about researching mind control and chemical interrogation techniques.
I've heard that the U.S. government was pretty worried about Soviet and Chinese brainwashing techniques,
Yeah.
like the ones that were used on American soldiers.
True, yeah. They were worried about the soldiers' vulnerability. They wanted to develop countermeasures, but some evidence suggests that the CIA's interest went beyond just, defense. It seems that they were also interested in weaponizing these techniques.
So they weren't just looking to protect their troops. They were looking to use it against their enemies.
Yeah, it's a very disturbing aspect of this whole program. It raises a lot of questions about the ethical boundaries they were willing to cross, all in the name of national security. They were looking at ways to manipulate foreign leaders, develop truth serums, and even induce amnesia.
Wow, it makes you wonder how far they were willing to go.
Yeah.
So what methods did they use to conduct these experiments?
Well, they explored a bunch of different techniques. We're talking about hypnosis, drugs, and even things adapted from stage magic. Primarily, that last one was for covert communication. However, a lot of what we know about MKUltra is still very mysterious. Most of the program's records were destroyed in 1973.
Oh, wow. That's really a shame. It makes it really hard to know what happened. But we do know that LSD became a big focal point in MKUltra experiments.
Yeah. They were really fascinated with how LSD seemed to break down the barriers of the conscious mind, making people more open to suggestion, potentially. Initial research was carried out in controlled labs, but that shifted to what they called real-world testing, and that's really where things went very wrong.
They started testing it on people without their knowledge or consent.
Unfortunately, yes, and with pretty bad consequences. There was one case where a CIA operative unknowingly ingested LSD. It was in his coffee. He ended up having a psychotic episode while he was driving in Washington, D.C. He crashed his car. Thankfully, there were no casualties. It's scary to think what could have happened.
Yeah, it shows a real lack of regard for human life. Let's talk about Frank Olson, whose name has become synonymous with MKUltra. Frank Olson was an Army biowarfare expert who worked at Camp Detrick.
Yes, now known as Fort Detrick. Back in 1953, Olson's CIA supervisor, Sidney Gottlieb, secretly gave him LSD. It was during a retreat, and the events that followed are very tragic and controversial.
Olson died under suspicious circumstances, didn't he?
He did. He fell from a window of a New York City hotel. The initial ruling was suicide, but the circumstances surrounding his fall have always been suspicious.
Olson's family believes that he was murdered by the CIA to prevent him from revealing what he knew about MKUltra. In the 1970s, the case was reopened as part of the Congressional investigations into the program. Sadly, no conclusive answers were ever found about his death.
Yeah. The lack of clear answers has just fueled all kinds of speculation and conspiracy theories. His case is a reminder of how secretive the program was and the impact it had on everyone involved.
It is a fascinating and very tragic story. The congressional committees that investigated MKUltra, the Church Committee, and the Rockefeller Commission uncovered a lot of disturbing information. They found evidence of these unethical experiments that were conducted on citizens. And of course, that sparked a lot of public outrage and demands for reform.
Yeah, their work was really crucial in exposing the truth about MKUltra. It really prompted a lot of changes in how the intelligence community operates.
They also uncovered another story about Dr. Ewan Cameron. He was a Scottish psychiatrist, and he was recruited by the CIA to conduct MKUltra experiments in Canada.
Cameron worked at the Allen Memorial Institute. It was there that he developed a controversial technique called psychic driving.
What exactly was the theory behind psychic driving?
So he believed that by erasing a patient's existing memories, he could basically reset their psyche, potentially cure mental illnesses, things like schizophrenia, and rebuild their personality from scratch.
It sounds a bit like science fiction.
You're not wrong. The techniques that he used were very unconventional. Cameron used a mix of drug therapy, electroconvulsive therapy, and sensory deprivation. In some cases, he would keep patients in drug-induced comas for weeks or even months.
Wow, what did that involve?
Well, he would put patients in soundproof rooms. Sometimes he would cover their eyes and ears, deprive them of almost all sensory input. The idea was to break down their sense of self and make them more receptive to this reprogramming.
And on top of that, he would subject them to these repetitive audio recordings.
Yeah. Often they contained negative messages or even commands, hoping to implant these new thoughts and behaviors.
Oh, that's just horrific.
It was. A lot of Cameron's patients suffered permanent psychological damage. They experienced amnesia, lost the ability to speak or care for themselves. Some of them even regressed to childlike states.
It's awful. Did Cameron know he was working for the CIA?
Well, how much he knew about the CIA's involvement is up for debate. We know his work was funded by the CIA, but it was through a front organization. It was called the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology. It's very possible that he didn't know the full extent of their involvement or their true intentions.
It's such a tragic story. Cameron's experiments were some of the most brutal and controversial of the entire MKUltra program. What happened to him?
Cameron continued his research until he died in 1967, but obviously the revelations about his involvement in MKUltra really tarnished his reputation, and it cast a shadow over his legacy. His victims weren't so lucky. Many of them suffered for years with psychological trauma.
That's heartbreaking. Did any of them ever receive justice?
Some of them were able to sue the Canadian government for compensation, but many others died before they ever saw any justice for what they went through.
MKUltra casts a long and very disturbing shadow.
It does. The secrecy surrounding the program, the unethical experiments, and the lasting trauma make it one of the most controversial chapters in the history of intelligence operations. The roots of MKUltra go all the way back to 1945. That's when the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency was formed.
What did that agency do?
So this agency was in charge of Operation Paperclip.
Operation Paperclip. That was the program that brought former Nazi scientists to the U.S., right?
Exactly. These scientists were recruited to work on a bunch of different projects. Some of them actually dealt with mind control research.
That must have been controversial.
Yeah, especially considering the atrocities committed by the Nazi regime. The U.S. government's justification was that they needed to use the expertise of these scientists, to get an advantage in the Cold War.
It's a morally gray area for sure. So these former enemies of the state were working with American scientists, researching ways to control the mind.
Yeah, it definitely raises questions about how far they were willing to go to win. This was a time of a lot of paranoia and fear, remember. The U.S. government was convinced that the Soviet Union and China were using brainwashing techniques.
Oh, really? Where?
They thought it was being used against American prisoners of war during the Korean War, and they were desperate to catch up.
So they felt like they needed to, fight fire with fire?
Yeah, kind of. MKUltra came out of that desperation. They wanted to understand these techniques and then use them against their enemies.
So how did it all begin?
MKUltra wasn't officially started until 1953, but there were several earlier projects that laid the groundwork for it. One of these was Project Chatter. It was launched in 1947. The focus there was mainly identifying and testing truth serums to use during interrogations.
Project Chatter. What else did they look into?
There was Project Bluebird. That was in 1950. It later became Project Artichoke in 1951. These projects were all about exploring different mind control techniques, like hypnosis, drug-induced states, and even electroshock therapy.
So these early projects sound like they were kind of experimental.
You could say that, yeah. They paved the way for the much larger and more ambitious undertakings of MKUltra. So Sidney Gottlieb was the head of the CIA's Technical Services Staff. That's the division that was responsible for developing these tools and techniques.
Tools and techniques, meaning things like poisons and mind-altering drugs.
Yeah. Gottlieb was very involved in developing these substances and techniques. They could be used for covert operations, things like assassinations and mind control. He was convinced that winning the Cold War meant pushing boundaries.
Even ethical ones.
Even ethical ones, unfortunately. He was a product of his time. It was a time when fear and paranoia were really high. Because of the Cold War, there was this feeling that anything was justified in the name of national security. He really believed that the U.S. was in a struggle for survival against the Soviets.
So he felt justified in these experiments, even on people like Frank Olson.
Yeah, sadly. Gottlieb's belief in his mission seems to have been stronger than any ethical concerns. He wanted a world where mind control could be used to program assassins and extract secrets, even control world leaders.
Like something out of a spy movie.
Right. But it wasn't just fantasy for Gottlieb. It was something he actively pursued. He led the CIA in pouring millions of dollars into this network. It was this shadowy network of researchers and scientists and agents, all working on unlocking the secrets of mind control.
Wow. We know that LSD was a central part of these experiments. Why were they so focused on that drug in particular?
Well, they thought LSD held the key to controlling the human mind. Its ability to disrupt thoughts and make people more suggestible really interested them. Some researchers even thought they could use LSD to create a real-life Manchurian candidate.
Someone who could be programmed to carry out assassinations.
Exactly, without even realizing it.
That's a terrifying thought.
It is. And it's important to remember that Frank Olson was not the only victim. There are other cases of people dying under very suspicious circumstances after being involved in MKUltra experiments.
But there's not much information on those cases.
Right. The details are very murky and difficult to verify. It makes you realize that they were experimenting on people and potentially causing harm, maybe even death.
Yeah, it's hard to grasp the scale of the damage that was caused.
It is. Because those MKUltra records were destroyed, we may never know the full scope of the program and its impact.
The lack of accountability is very troubling. How many victims were there? And how were their lives affected?
That's one of the most disturbing parts of all of this. We may never know the full truth. It shows us the dangers of power without limits. And it reminds us about the importance of transparency and oversight.
For sure. You mentioned Dr. Ewan Cameron and his psychic driving technique. Were there other methods that they used? Other drugs, maybe?
They used a lot of other mind-altering drugs. Barbiturates, amphetamines, even heroin. They were interested in heroin because it was so addictive.
They were trying to control people through addiction.
Yeah. The idea was that if you could control the addiction, you could control the person.
That's a horrifying concept.
It is. They also looked into chemical and biological agents, including things like toxins and pathogens.
Toxins and pathogens.
Yeah. They wanted to see if they could use them to incapacitate enemies or even eliminate them. And it wasn't just drugs and chemicals. They also investigated psychological techniques.
Like what?
Like hypnosis. They thought it could be used to get secrets from people or to program them to carry out actions. Kind of like that Manchurian candidate idea we talked about earlier.
Do we know if they were ever successful with hypnosis?
A lot of that research is still classified. It's hard to say for sure. There are a lot of rumors that they were able to create these sleeper agents. People who could be programmed to do things without even knowing it.
That's terrifying.
I know. We don't know if they ever actually achieved that. But we do know that they were very interested in hypnosis.
Yeah.
And its potential for mind control and manipulation.
I remember reading that they even hired a magician to help them with their research.
Yeah, John Mulholland. He was a famous stage magician, an expert in deception and illusion.
Why did they want him?
They wanted him to write a manual on how to use stage magic techniques for espionage.
How could magic be used for espionage?
Well, think about what stage magic is all about. Sleight of hand, misdirection, illusions. Those could be very valuable skills for spies.
Like something you'd see in James Bond.
Exactly. The CIA saw how they could apply these techniques to real-life espionage, planting and retrieving objects without getting caught, creating distractions, even escaping from tough situations.
Do we know if CIA agents actually used the manual?
Unfortunately, that's classified information. But it's definitely possible that some of the things he described made it into their arsenal.
MKUltra really went into some strange areas. It's both fascinating and scary at the same time.
Right. It makes you think about how vulnerable the human mind really is. We think of our minds as these strong fortresses. But MKUltra showed us that they can be influenced and manipulated in ways we don't fully understand.
It makes you wonder what's real and what isn't.
Exactly. If your memories and perceptions can be changed, how can you be sure of anything?
That's a question that people have been asking for a long time.
Yeah, and MKUltra really brought that question to the public's attention.
And the dangers of too much power.
Especially in the government. When you have secrecy and no accountability, it's a recipe for disaster.
It's a lesson we should always keep in mind. Even though MKUltra was a Cold War program, it still affects how we think about the mind and the ethics of research, and how important it is to protect individual rights.
You're absolutely right.
We've talked a lot about MKUltra. It was a top secret project, right? And its goal was to, unlock those secrets of mind control.
Right.
And we've gone over the origins, the techniques, those tragic stories.
Yeah.
But how did it all become public? How did something so secret get exposed?
Well, it was a few things happening at the same time. The early 70s were pretty chaotic.
Oh, yeah.
The Vietnam War was ending.
Right.
And then there was Watergate.
That really shook things up.
Yeah. Public trust in the government was really low. People started questioning those in power, demanding more transparency.
And then Nixon resigned in '74.
It was a big deal. It made people think that the government was capable of doing bad things, really bad things. And that's when a Senate committee was formed.
Led by Senator Frank Church.
Yes. It was 1975. They were supposed to investigate illegal activities by the CIA and other agencies.
So they weren't specifically looking into MKUltra.
Not at first. They were looking at broader abuses, like illegal surveillance and covert operations.
Okay.
But then, In their investigation, they found evidence of MKUltra.
I bet the CIA wasn't happy about that.
No, not at all. They tried to minimize it.
Of course.
They said most of the records were gone, destroyed in '73 on Richard Helms's orders. So it was hard to figure out the full extent of the program, they said.
But the church committee wasn't giving up, right?
No, they were determined. They interviewed people who used to work for the CIA, even Sidney Gottlieb.
Wow.
They put together this really disturbing picture of what was happening.
And what did they find?
They found unethical experiments on U.S. citizens, LSD and other drugs used without consent,
Wow.
and a relentless pursuit of mind control techniques.
That must have been a huge shock to the public.
It was. Imagine finding out that your own government had been doing these experiments on you. Without you knowing, people were outraged.
Did it lead to any changes in how things are done?
It did. The investigations led to reforms.
Good.
There was more transparency, more accountability. One big change was the creation of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence.
What does that committee do?
They watch over the intelligence community. It's a permanent committee.
Makes sense?
Another outcome was the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA, passed in '78.
What does that do?
It set up rules for electronic surveillance and searches for foreign intelligence. You need a warrant from a special court for those activities.
So MKUltra, even though it was bad, led to some good things.
Yes, more oversight and regulation.
And the Rockefeller Commission was also investigating, right?
Yes. In 1975, President Ford appointed them.
They were looking into domestic spying,
That's right. And they also found evidence of MKUltra.
adding to the public's concerns.
Yeah. They found that the CIA was working with universities and hospitals. They were doing research on people without consent. They used deception to get participants and to hide what the research was really about.
That's disturbing, to think that places like hospitals and universities were involved.
Yeah, it was a big blow to public trust.
So what happened after all this came out?
The CIA's reputation was really hurt. They had to admit what they did, and they put new rules in place to prevent it from happening again.
But did those changes go far enough? Could something like MKUltra happen again?
It's hard to say for sure. There have been a lot of changes.
Right.
But intelligence agencies are secretive,
That's true.
and there's always the potential for abuse.
So we need to keep watching.
Exactly. We have to be vigilant. We need to protect people's rights.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Make sure the government is accountable.
That's right. MKUltra is a reminder of what can go wrong.
Yeah. It makes you think about ethics in research, too.
It does. Researchers have a responsibility to protect their subjects.
It's fascinating and disturbing at the same time.
It is. It's inspired so many books and movies.
It really captures the imagination.
It does, but it's hard to separate fact from fiction.
Because of all the secrecy.
Yeah, and the missing records. There are a lot of conspiracy theories.
Well, it makes you think about the nature of reality, about the limits of control,
Yes.
and about the dark side of power.
It's a cautionary tale. We need to safeguard our freedoms and hold those in power responsible.
Now, from mind control to minds that are out of control, Simon and Tom will be here on Sunday, but in the meantime, tune in tomorrow for another great true crime episode.